Greetings Guzzlers, it's baking time again. And I've got my baker's oven. I know I normally have my own apron, but I've got my special one my sister bought me for my birthday. So I've got my Star Baker one. Thank you sis. Anyway, I'm going to bake some doughnuts. Okay, now doughnuts, by the way, is spelled D-O-U-G-H-N-U-T-S. Okay, although it can be called doughnuts, D-O nuts, but anyway, all sounds the same. We're going to make some doughnuts, but I'm going to make some mini doughnuts, and these are baked doughnuts, not fried. Wife won't eat them if I fry them. I can't do that, too fatty. Which, interestingly, modern doughnuts are nowhere near as fatty as old doughnuts. I'll tell you about that in a bit. But what I've got here is this little mini donut tray, if you like. I suppose you could also use this to make mini bagels, I suppose. And what I've done is I've greased the inside of them. They're meant to be non-stick, but reading some of the reviews on this, first time round, nothing stuck. After that, everything stuck. So I've greased them anyway. Okay, and that's what we're going to bake them in. And I'm going to have to, because I've only got one of those, we're going to have to tip the cooked ones out, let it cool down, re-grease it, because we may well get 2 and a bit trays worth of doughnuts out of this dough. So we're going to make some mini baked doughnuts, again courtesy of Cupcake Jemma. Now the amount we're making is going to be too small really to go in the big stand mixer, so we're going to use the hand mixer. And I'm starting with some soft unsalted butter. I've got 70 grams of that, and we'll put that in there. And I've got 55 grams of caster sugar. And what we're going to do is then beat these together. Beat it out, if I plug it in. Right, I've got that cream together and it's starting to go nice and pale. But in this little bowl, I'm just going to put 1 egg, preferably without any shell. And then I'm going to add half a teaspoon of vanilla extract to that egg. And then we're just going to beat that lightly together before I add it to that mixture. Now, doughnuts, so I'll just tell you about the spelling, and nowadays typically the 2 words are, or 2 different spellings, you know, they're sort of like synonymous with each other, if you like. No one really bothers too much. Although the original spelling was dough, D-O-U-G-H. And they are usually deep fried. But like I said, we're not doing those, we're doing baked ones. And there are doughnuts that are baked. So anyway, I'm just going to get that in there, and I'm just going to whip those two together. Get our dry ingredients together, and I'm going to sift it together, because we don't add that directly to that just yet. Okay, we're going to also need some buttermilk. So you're going to want 60 grams of buttermilk. I have actually got buttermilk this time. I normally make it, again using a Cupcake Jemma version, where she said if you can't buy it, how to make it. But strange enough, my Tesco's, my local supermarket, had tons of stuff, so I bought some. Anyway, we're going to fold this dry ingredient, germanium flour, into there in batches, intermingled as it were with buttermilk. So before we do that, we need to get this sifted. So you're going to want a little pinch of nutmeg. I suspect that ain't going to go through there. And then some bicarbonate of soda and some baking powder. Now, for the bicarb, you want 1/8 of a teaspoon. That's half, I thought that was a quarter. So, about that. And for the baking powder, you want 1/2 teaspoon, so I do want that one. Okay, in that goes. Get rid of them. We also want a pinch of salt, in that goes. finally I've got some plain white flour, 120 grams. And what we're now going to do is just going to sift that through. And like I say, we'll be ready then to fold that in. Now, I was telling you about doughnuts and how they were originally fried. Essentially, they are believed to, you know, they're quite an old thing. They reckon that in 1485, in a cookbook published in Nuremberg, I ain't going to try and pronounce it in the German or whatever, but it basically translates to Mastery of the Kitchen. They have a recipe for these sugar-free stuffed fried dough cakes. Geflügelte crap or something. Can't pronounce that, don't know German. I did Latin at school, but it was a choice of Latin or German, and I did Latin because I like the classics, you know, classical. Anyway, just going to get all that sieved. Like I say, that nutmeg ain't going to go through there, so I might have to help that a little bit. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about doughnuts and also how we're then going to add it to that. I've got rid of my mixer because we're going to do the rest of it by hand, as it were. I'm going to put about a third of that flour mix in there, and we're going to add half of that buttermilk. So like I said, there was about 60 grams of buttermilk, and he says making a complete mess of it. We're just going to fold all that through. Now, doughnuts, I suppose, in a way, sort of traditionally get associated with sort of America and American cops and things like that. But doughnuts were introduced into New York by the Dutch settlers in the early 18th century because they were producing these things, olijkek, or something like that, which basically translates out as oily cake. And these were doughnuts, balls, not ring doughnuts like we're making, that were made out of dough and then cooked in hog fat, so sort of like lard really, and therefore were quite oily. Right, I'm now just going to add another third of that flour. I'm going to mix that in, and then I'm going to mix in the remainder of that buttermilk, and then we'll finish off once that's mixed in by adding in the flour. So in the remaining buttermilk goes. So that was like the first version of doughnuts, if you like. In 1750 there was a cookbook entitled How to Make Herefordshire Cakes, Nuts and Pincushions, and it was written by, or it was in a compendium by William Ellis, and that was another recipe for fried doughnuts again. In 1800, again in another Hertfordshire book, or Herefordshire book, sorry, no, Hertfordshire, sorry, I'm getting me Herefords and my Herts all mixed up. There was a recipe for doughnuts, spelled D-O-W, by a Baron Thomas Dinsdale, the wife of Baron Thomas Dinsdale. And then the first cookbook that actually calls them doughnuts, D-O-U-G-H, was in 1803, and it was The Frugal Housewife or Complete Woman Cook. And they include them as an American recipe. Right, so what we're going to do is, to try and get it fairly even in here, we're going to use a piping bag. So I haven't got a nozzle in it. What we're going to do is we're going to cut the end off when we're ready. So all I'm going to do now is transfer that into it. What we want to do is obviously get it down the bottom here, but we also want to try and knock out any air bubbles. So I'm just giving it a good shake. We're just going to squeeze that down, and then you're going to need your oven on at 170 fan. I must admit, I haven't checked the temperature yet. 170 fan, and then, like I say, we'll be baking them in batches because there's going to be too much for one tray, should be. I was telling you about some of the early recipes for it. In Washington Irving's book of 1809, A History of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, he actually, it's a book, it's not a recipe book, that he mentions, but it was always sure to boast of an enormous dish of balls of sweetened dough, fried in hog's fat and called doughnuts, or oelekeks, a delicious kind of cake. So that was like perhaps the first printed reference referring to donuts. So what I'm going to do now is get my scissors, and we're going to chop off. So we've got about a 1 centimetre diameter hole, and we're going to want this about 2/3 full. So you can see it's a lot easier doing it with a piping bag. Whoops, see, there you go, there's an air bubble there, farting at me. So we're just going to, and actually, perhaps these are a bit bigger than the tray that Jemma used, because I don't think I'm going to make more than about 12 here. In fact, I might be lucky to get 12 out, I think. And we're going to bake for about 9 to 10 minutes. So I want to put the timer on for 9, and then we'll check them. We don't want to get them too dark in colour, but obviously want them cooked. And then we'll bring them out, let them cool briefly, tip them onto a wire rack, and then we are ready to let that cool down and make some more. So where did the ring donut come from? Well, one of the problems with frying up these dough balls in the oil or the fat was that often what would happen is that you either had to, like, pretty much, you know, really over bake the outside to get the inside cooked, or you ended up getting a nice sort of like brownie colour on the outside and it was raw in the middle. Now, Hanson Gregory, who was 16 and he was working on board a trading ship in 1847, and he's the guy supposedly credited with inventing the ring donut. He grossly disliked these oily cakes that were full of fat because they'd been cooked for so long, but yet they were still raw in the middle. So he claims that he had a brainwave, and he was making his dough cake, and he took the ship's pepper pot, which was just about the right size that he could poke a hole through the middle, and then he fried these rings of dough, and of course, lo and behold, all nicely baked all the way through, and hence we end up with the ring donut. Now actually, there are some places that sell donut holes. What they're actually selling is the little balls of dough that have been pushed out the centre, because some people make ring donuts by literally cutting out the centre of the dough, and then they can use these little balls, they fry them up, and you've got mini donuts, if you like, called donuts. Or others actually extrude it, so rather than put it in tins, it's actually extruded as a ring. And obviously then you don't get the holes. Well, you get the holes, but you don't get the holes if you're with me. You may notice that I've got a large number of donuts here. It did literally make 1 tray's worth. So I've made a double batch again. Well, I made another batch, but I've doubled everything up. So I've got about 38 donuts now. These are the latest ones out of the oven. They started cooling down now. Now I did taste one because I'm a bit concerned what they'd be like, and they do taste very cakey. You can see the bottom, the bit was in the tin. is slightly browner than what was on top. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to coat these in chocolate, or rather I'm going to coat the tops in chocolate. So I've got to let these all cool completely, and I've got another couple in the, I'm going to say fridge then, in the oven. When they're out, when they're all cool, I've got some white chocolate here. We're going to melt that down, and I've got some sprinkles. So just to tell you a little bit more about the history of donuts, there's various speculation where the term donut, D-O, came from, including a 1929 Los Angeles Times article where the journalist was going on about the appalling spelling of people today, and he listed various words all spelt wrong, one of which was donut, spelt D-O. But others say it's to do with a donut manufacturing, equipment manufacturing company who decided that the donut, D-O-U-H, would confuse foreigners, so they called it Doughnuts with D-O, thinking that would help sell it to foreign markets. Who knows? But one final, Dunkin' Donuts, of course, used the word D-O for dough, but there you go. But one final little story goes back to World War One, where during World War One, apparently it was very difficult to get like fresh baked goods up to the soldiers. Now the Salvation Army decided that they wanted to help, and that 2 volunteers came up with the idea of making fresh donuts, and it was like, whew, sell out. Well, I say sell out, I don't think they were selling them, but soldiers flocked back to these huts to get these fresh baked donuts. And as a result, the Salvation Army in 1938 created Donut Day. However, that was then superseded by the Americans, who just decided to call the first Friday of every June Donut Day. But it originated from the Salvation Army one. One of the volunteers, Margaret Sheldon, wrote on one of her busiest days, "Today I made 22 pies, 300 donuts, 700 cups of coffee." And for her services and her fellow co-workers or volunteers, the soldiers nicknamed them donut dollies. So I've melted down some white chocolate, and donuts nice and cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dunk it into the white chocolate. Ooh, that's hot there. And then we're just going to put it onto the rack. Now you could do your traditional sort of sugar coating. I didn't want to, because the way to do it would be to brush them in melted butter. Not a lot, because you don't want it too buttery, but I've got a skin in the middle of that one, so you couldn't see the hole. Brush it in a little bit of melted butter all over, and then toss them in some caster sugar, but I've decided to go for chocolate, so we're just going through, and then I'm just going to add some little sprinkles. I might see how we go. I might try some dark chocolate, I might try some without sprinkles, but I think the sprinkles definitely add a little bit to it. So I'm just going to get decorating these, and then we'll be ready to taste one. The trials I go through. I've been transferring these to the fridge just to help the chocolate set a bit quicker, but this is sort of my first batch out. So like I say, I made about 3 dozen in the end, but let's give one a go. Very cakey. In a way, it does steal the texture. I'm thinking of the actual donut. It's donutty. It just, I don't know, I was going to say it doesn't have that sort of, donuts aren't necessarily greasy, but I think it just tastes a little bit drier. I'm not saying it's dry, but drier than a fried donut. But other than that, It's definitely a different texture to cake. Still bloody good. I haven't told the wife how many I made yet, so a few more could disappear. But there you go. Your mini baked donuts.